a whole fleet of them. Look on the ASA. Oh my gosh. They're all going against the wind.
It was basically a cube with inside of a sphere where the points of the cube were touching outside of the sphere.
Roger. There's troubleshooting as soon as I
So this isn't anything that just is limited to the United States. It's a worldwide phenomenon.
That UFO podcast is powered by Zencastr. Zencastr is one of the world's leading platforms for recording and hosting podcasts. Zencastr is a modern web-based solution for high-quality audio and video podcast production. With a full suite of professional tools, Zencastr allows podcasters to quickly and seamlessly record their guests remotely and produce their podcasts in studio quality. Check out the links in the show description to find out more.
This is James Fox, and you're listening to That UFO Podcast.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to That UFO Podcast. My name is Andy, and with me is my bottling co-host Dan, who I did ask, did he want to read the intro? And he's just told us no, because again, he said the people aren't worth it, I think was his exact words. Is that right?
How can I compete with those beautiful northern tones?
Disappointing. But yeah, welcome everyone back to the podcast. And do you know what I realised I've just done? Someone had said earlier that they really like the podcast because we don't talk about inane nonsense for 20 minutes before we get into interviews or conversation and stuff. And I think we've started with it. But it's not 20 minutes, it's like 40 seconds so far, so that's okay.
We do talk about a lot of stuff before we start recording that people could maybe say was inane nonsense, you know. But
yeah, we get that out the way though, all the libel stuff, just to make sure that we're good. But listen, we want to just firstly say thank you to the sponsor Manscaped who have come on board recently, and thank you all the listeners who so far have used the promo code AndyUFO. Manscaped have been very generous reaching out to us, and they sent myself and Dan some of their stuff for free. Dan's just been telling me about the boxers he was wearing that he got, which were pretty cool. We got t-shirts as well, which we're not wearing at the minute, but I will be doing a little unboxing video for the social media soon, so it really is appreciated. And they sent us the Lawnmower 4.0, the groomer, which was really, really cool. I used that last night for the first time, and it's a great piece of kit. It's premium stuff, it's really good quality, and I'm glad people appreciated me slipping in some of the ufology or UFO talk and with some of the reads as well. For example, Dan, the upgraded trimmer giving you a multifunction on-off switch that can engage the travel lock, and also gives you the ability to turn the 4000K LED spotlight on and off when needed for a more precise shave. The spotlight would put the Phoenix lights to shame. Now that is some good, that is some good stuff, isn't it?
No word of a lie, I literally used it as a torch yesterday.
Yeah, and only Dan would get a really high-end premium male groomer and just use the torch on it. But it just shows you how good he is with this kind of stuff, you know, being, what's the word, being efficient or being creative? I'm not too sure. But either way, it's appreciated for all of you who have headed over to manscaped.com in the early days of our sponsorship. You get 20% off and free shipping with the code AndyUFO. So AndyUFO at checkout. 20% off and free shipping as well. It really does make a difference to the podcast. It is a really good product. We've got it, we've tried it, and we appreciate all of your support as well. And if it's not for yourself, get a gift for a family member or a friend or you know, someone you don't like, send them a gift, you know, even if you hate them. Why not? It's nice to be nice, isn't it, Dan?
Yeah, spread love in the world.
Yeah, Dan's all about spreading love. Listen, quite a cool night for UFO news, to be honest. We got a Tom DeLonge Jim Semivan interview last night, Dan, didn't we? And I was quite impressed by it. Seen pretty good write-ups and people quite happy with it. I know you've got a lot of notes. I've got a lot of notes. But what else we're going to talk about after that is, if you've heard one of Ross Coulthart's many, many interviews recently, I am still speaking to him next month when things will be a bit fresher, and he's got some new information coming out, apparently. He mentioned Bob Fish, or Robert Fish, as people may know him as, someone whose name comes up when we hear about John Podesta and leaked emails and all that kind of stuff as well. And Ross Coulthart said on a few interviews, people should be speaking to Bob Fish. I did reach out to Bob Fish as soon as I heard that, Bob was very gracious and sent me back quite a lengthy email, or a couple of emails with some stuff that he's more than happy for me to quote. He isn't looking to do any interviews just now or engage with the UFO community, as he says. I've read out to Dan before. Dan was quite impressed with the responses I was given. Yeah, almost a little bit disappointed that he's not coming on to talk to anyone just now. And do you know what? If he does agree to speak to someone, brilliant. I would love to speak to him, but he definitely, given what he said to me, sounds like someone that you want to hear from. I'm going to read out the response in full after we've talked about the Tom DeLonge and Jim Semivan interview.
We should say as well that Andy has asked permission to read these responses out. It's important to just always treat people with respect, and I just wanted to be clear in that.
Yeah, whenever I get a quote from anyone at all, I always make sure it's okay for me to share anything. Sometimes people will tell me, say this instead, or they'll tidy up what they've said a little bit. Bob was very, very gracious to say, do you know what? Yeah, you can share that information. That's fine. So what I'm going to do is read it out, and it'll also be posted on Twitter as well. Maybe not by me. I have asked Joe Murgia, who loves to transcribe stuff, if he wants to post it, because he loves digging through that kind of material as well. So it will be coming out on Twitter as well for folks to kind of read through, retweet and digest a little bit more, but I will read it out at the end of this. However, last night we had Into the Impossible with Brian Keating. We're also joined by Kurt Jaimungo of Theories of Everything podcast as well. And they had Tom DeLonge and Jim Semivan on for an interview, and there was no Angels and Airwaves chat, no Blink 182 chat. It was UFOs, consciousness, aliens, UAP, and all the good stuff that many of us want to hear about.
I'd say there was a little Angels chat, just because there was a little chat about creativity and how it kind of influences, how the phenomena influences Tom and his art.
Like I said, there was no Angels and Airwaves chat unless you're Dan and a massive fan of Tom DeLonge, proper fanboy, where it was like, oh, Angels and Airwaves. Yeah, Angels and Airwaves, Tom. Yeah. Do you know what? If I had Tom on the podcast and he said, okay, I'll answer one question, Dan would totally ruin it with, oh, your next album, what's it going to be like? Is it going to be a creative expression of your... Yeah. But listen, it was really good to hear Tom just coming on a podcast where he's not really done for a while properly and engaging in conversation. So... you seem to get really good write-ups and good reviews. What were your initial thoughts, Dan, when it finished?
I mean, some of the stuff that Jim said was pretty, startling. One of the things we'll talk about, he said during the TMZ kind of marathon a few weeks back or a few months back. Time is weird in the pandemic. But in terms of Tom and how he was, I think this is the interview that everyone kind of wanted from him for a while. And if he was like this on Joe Rogan, where he was a little bit reserved in what he was saying, but a bit more confident in specific places, I think it would have done wonders. I couldn't help but wonder, what if?
What I will say is, yes, I enjoyed it from a selfish interviewer's point of view, and having the podcast, it gave me a lot of ammunition for when I get to speak to Tom DeLonge, because there is a whole lot there. I was, that thing I've talked about where I'm shouting, ask this or follow up on this, and it just wasn't done. And there's definitely, I think, a few things that he mentioned that I was like, you could have got in there, but it wasn't necessarily the audience for that.
There's this thing where certain people, like Lou, like Tom, Hal, people like that, they don't like to say what the government knows. But it seems that if you give them a chance to preface it with, in my opinion, they will tell you a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, we have to remember, this isn't a UFO podcast he was on. It was a scientific podcast. Brian Keating announced at the start of it that he was also part of the Galileo project with Avi Loeb and others. He's on the advisory side of things. I believe that was what he said, Dan. Right. Yeah,
like a research affiliate.
Yeah, so that's good to see he's involved in that, and a self-confessed skeptic, which is great, and that's fine. That's what we need. Someone coming into this who would be more than happy for, yep, there's nothing in it, and we've proved that. But also, he's coming into it to say maybe there is something to it, and I would love there to be UFOs dipping in and out the ocean, or nuts and bolts craft, or non-physical craft materializing in orbit. Spoiler alert, but. That's good to see, and that's good to have him on board. And we also had Kurt Jaimungo, like I say, host of Theories of Everything podcast. Hopefully, we might be speaking to Kurt soon on this podcast as well. That's early talks for that one, folks. As a bit of a news drop for you. Kurt came into this from a very inquisitive place where you could really see he doesn't know what to think yet of the subject. And you can see the wheels turning in his head, which when you've got a video podcast, it's good to kind of see that on YouTube, where there was a lot of pauses that I think if you were just listening to the audio, you might have been like, why the big gap, or delete that, or a post-production program might remove a lot of those silences. But when you're watching it, you can see he's almost a little confused at some of the stuff being talked about. Not that he doesn't understand, but just from a point of view of, I can't believe I'm talking about this as potentially being real.
Yeah, absolutely. Kurt likes to use his interviews as a kind of like office hours. So everything's very conversational, and it's him exploring ideas. And you're exactly right. That's why we get the kind of silences where you can see the cogs whirring. But that's why I really love his channel, because he's thoughtful. And what more can you ask for,
That's it. So into the interview, I've got a ton of notes here. I know Dan does as well. And I liked already a few people on Twitter, when I asked them their thoughts, said they hadn't listened to it. They were going to wait on myself and Dan breaking it down for them. So if you've not heard it yet, hopefully we can do it justice. Right at the start, Jim Semivan, who is far more elusive than Tom DeLonge and doing these kind of things, and someone I wish we heard more from. He says early on, when he was first introduced to Tom DeLonge, and Tom was starting to get involved at the level he eventually got to with Lou Elizondo, Chris Mellon, Jim Semivan, Hal Puthoff, Steve Justice, all those guys. He felt Tom DeLonge putting his information together and explaining what he thought had hit the nail on the head with his kind of summary of what the phenomenon may or may not be. And that seems to be quite an endorsement from Jim Semivan of Tom DeLonge's line of thinking, Dan, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. And it was really interesting that Tom followed on from that comment with talking about consciousness and science as, we have them kind of separate at the moment, and they used to be one and the same. And he thinks what's ahead of us is that those things are going to become one and the same. And he explained, which he might have said before, but I didn't realize, that the arts and science in, TTSA, he thinks of the arts as ideas and consciousness. So really what that is consciousness and science.
Yeah, and he's kind of getting at the fact that, 2,000 years ago or more, people's way of understanding magic or science was religion, because that was how they could understand things at that time. And that's maybe why a lot of these things are put into context of religious texts. He mentioned our brains just being, quick side note, do you know what it made me think of as well, though, was like, if religion was the science of the time and how things were understood, and then it's evolved into, science hopefully taking over a bit more. You remember in the South Park episode with the otters, where basically it is science is the new religion, but it's evolved to a place of where people are now warring over science, and it's the same question just asked 3 different ways. And it's like, that's where you could see, hopefully not, but the evolution of science could go if it takes over as the new religion. But yeah, it just made me think of that, the way Tom mentioned it. And he mentioned initially something I've talked about before, and we've talked about, Dan, on the podcast with different guests, that, as we are some type of antenna, which makes me think, are our brains just receivers? That the soul isn't necessarily based locally. The idea of like Casper the Friendly Ghost, when you die and your soul floats out your body. Maybe that's not how it works, and you've talked about the idea before that your brain just receives a signal from somewhere else, and it could be totally non-local, that you're experiencing what you experience as the human condition because you're getting that signal from elsewhere. I kind of got a little bit of that when, again, it's not the first time I've heard this mentioned about being an antenna of some sorts. What do you like about that kind of thing, or not like, even? Although I think you do like that conversation.
I love it. We've spoken about this before, and it's a really interesting thing to me to think about. The thing I worry about with the antenna analogy is that people think of it like, we have an antenna and then we have like a broadcasting station elsewhere. So people will be like, well, where's the source coming from? When really the source is, it's all layered up on top of each other. So it's not necessarily that, there's a beacon on Alpha Centauri beaming out consciousness. It's that consciousness permeates everything, and we can just view this level basically in this world, and that there may be other ones beside us and above us, and it's really crazy to think about.
I think Jim Semivan mentioned at some point, I think it was later on, but to do with Oh no, actually, sorry, I'm getting it confused with the Bob Fish email, and there's something relevant that Bob says later on about your eyes and ears can't see certain things, but your mind can potentially view them. And I'll read that out within the context of the email later. But again, it gets back to, when you dream, does it take away those kind of senses that maybe interfere with being able to see all that other stuff, and the world of remote viewing and all that kind of stuff as well. So I thought that was pretty interesting point. Skinwalker Ranch was mentioned very early on by Kurt. He just kind of blurted it out. It was like there was a little bit of mumbling in the context, and then Skinwalker Ranch, what's going on there? And Tom was like, me? So I don't think there was anything necessarily new there, was there, where he talks about multiple things happening at Skinwalker Ranch, umbrella phenomenon, there's potential, dimensional or different dimensions at play, time displacement. What were your thoughts? Because I want to talk a little bit about the idea of displacing time and how these things may or may not appear.
Yeah, this was an interesting section. Tom, Jim was pretty reserved. He just said, a lot of stuff happens there. Whereas Tom had more knowledge of it than I expected. He spoke about Skinwalker as a kind of pathway for discussing alternative explanations aside from ET. Because the data doesn't seem to necessarily suggest that it is ET. He mentioned that the craft seemed to displace our time like a sub in the ocean, which is really interesting because we've definitely touched on speaking about the medium that we are in, and we always use the ocean analogy, right? But in that analogy, I guess the ocean would be time itself. And there's not really been done a lot of research on that kind of idea. Or on time itself, to be honest. So it'll be interesting if that's the path that this goes down. Later on, Tom does kind of say to Kurt and Ryan that that's their hope, that by talking about this, these aspects will start to be explored.
Yeah. So I know it's kind of touched on in a couple of different places, right? And I think it'd be a good time to talk about it. The whole idea of like displacing time, and I think this might be something I kind of position really badly, so I try and use analogies that I understand to try and get my point across. Okay,
that's cool. That's what our analogies are for.
So a few things when you think about, for example, if you're talking about a place like Skinwalker Ranch just being a really strong place forget the TV show, right? Forget they're trying to make a TV show as part of it. That there's something going on there, right? If you imagine one of these objects, and Tom talks about that they don't necessarily come from far away in space, and we've talked about, again, Dan, to our credit, I'd like to think on this program that potentially they materialize in space because maybe it's an easier way to come into this reality and not have all those different factors of weather and atmospheres and all that kind of stuff, maybe.
Yeah. And there's the idea as well that the propulsion system would expel so much energy that it could be really dangerous for them to do on Earth. It might wipe out a state or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, right. So I've talked about as well that, so imagine like we are in the ocean, okay? And one of these things wants to come in. If you come in from the top of the ocean, you're having to puncture that initial layer of water on the top, okay? And it only takes a tiny bit of force to do that. But maybe they have to do something similar to get into this reality where there's some level of force has to be applied to get through.
That's interesting because, as you know, TTSA have a bunch of books and they're all called secret machines. And there's a reason for that. The secret in the title is kind of a play on the idea that these machines are secreted from elsewhere. So, you've just explained that, and it's the same thing. Okay,
cool. I haven't actually read those yet. I've got a few on audiobook that I do mean to get to, and I will definitely get to at some point. I'd love to talk about them more.
The Gods, Man, and War Isn't Out Yet series is a little bit dry, but it talks about a lot of really interesting things. Whereas the other series, Chasing Shadows and A Fire Within, are more like Dan Brown Airport kind of reads. They're a lot of fun and you'll get through them quickly, but imagine Dan Brown but with UFO lore.
Okay, cool. So that's my thinking, is that maybe these things sometimes have to push through, and that's why you get the kind of, people talk about gravitational lensing and all that kind of effects, and maybe that affects how we can take clear pictures of them or videos and all that kind of stuff, and why they can look blurry and hazy. So it would be the same as, pushing a submarine down the top of the ocean, the water doesn't go away, it just moves away from it. And you then have that kind of effect of them coming in, and it would look a bit warped and distorted.
Almost like creating like an interdimensional viewport that you can move around, but that viewport to us looks like a craft.
Hold that, yeah. So my other one is a little bit like, and I think I've talked on this before, Quantum Leap. He goes into a chamber, and the idea is that Al can be in the chamber. If you've not seen Quantum Leap, guy goes in and travels back in time. Great TV show. Go and watch it.
Great TV show, yeah.
Hopefully they
disappointing ending though, I will say.
Hopefully it's not ended. Hopefully they bring it back. There's always talk about the way it comes back. Interesting ending. But the idea being that he jumps and leaps into different people's bodies in time and has to complete a purpose to then move on to hopefully try and leap home. Okay. Al, who is his kind of companion along the way, has done. He is accompanying him as a hologram. So he can't interact with the environment, but he can be there with him, and you see Al on the way. And I wonder, maybe is it a way that these things sometimes, especially maybe the non-physical ones, go into some sort of apparatus on one end that allows them, like I think you've just kind of said there, allows them to view this reality, or to some extent see this reality. You know, people talk about orbs and all that kind of stuff. Maybe that's an element of that, and it's how they can kind of come into this space without necessarily physically being here.
How about a nice Futurama reference? Do you remember the episode where they make a time machine that only goes forward?
Yeah.
And they like overshoot the end of the universe, and they have to loop back around and stuff like that. But if you think about that specific craft, that craft was in one place. It did not move. The universe, kind of moved around it. But given that we move through a physical space, to anyone on Earth looking at that craft, it would look like that craft was moving. And it would be moving in the direction that, probably opposite to where the Earth was moving and where the universe was moving and everything like that. So and essentially that craft was a viewport throughout time, and it could just loop and loop and loop, and it looked like it did crazy, crazy stuff. But to the occupants, it was perfectly reasonable. There weren't any crazy G-forces because they were still.
The physics of that would hurt your head, though, wouldn't they? Like, I'm not a mathematician at all.
This
but
is
even
why I'm pleased Brian and, Eric Weinstein and Kurt are kind of getting in on it, because these are the guys who can do the equations instead of just wax lyrical,
Absolutely. But yeah, I just wanted to bring that up there as a, speculative piece on that kind of idea, and just to get people thinking a little bit about nuts and bolts craft and traveling from A to B. This is stuff that potentially we have to start looking at. And when we keep hearing things like the universe or the phenomenon is far stranger than we can think of or can perceive or can imagine, it's that kind of stuff where you have to start going, it's not just how we understand things traveling from A to B. It could be all of this or none of what we talk about at all, and something no one's even considered, which is probably just as likely.
Imagine trying to, like, say for example, we got the thing they made in Up and a dog could talk. And then you try and explain to the dog some of the things that happens in the world. The dog knows your house. They're fairly familiar with the people inside it. It doesn't know there are billions of other humans outside and billions of other dogs. It knows about birds maybe, but like my dog has a giraffe teddy, but she has no idea the giraffes are real. So there are certain things in the world that they would melt her brain, like, hey, look at this. This is a factory. What's a factory? There would be so much to explain. And it's going to be the same with us in this phenomena. The questions we are asking are they're almost childlike at the moment, just because we don't know what we're dealing with. And like, I think it was Brian said that there's no kind of real lexicon and collection of words that we can use to describe a lot of this stuff. And that's what we need to start building. And once we do that, we can actually start having proper scientific conversations about this stuff.
Absolutely. Even imagine going back in time, like 40 years, right? And approaching Steve Jobs and I can't remember, what was the other guy's name who helped him start Apple?
Steve Wozniak. There was another guy, but he sold his shares fairly early on, and he probably regrets it for the rest of his life.
Was it like $12,000 or something? And the shares are now worth like 300 million, something like that. Ridiculous, yeah. But well done that guy for helping start things. He's won morally, yay, go him.
Yeah,
but imagine going back in time and going to them and saying, okay, I've got this idea, like I'm from the future and it's an iPhone, and they'd be like, okay, and you're telling them what an iPhone does, they'd probably love it. And then they say, okay, how do we make it? You couldn't tell them how to make that. You couldn't tell them how it works.
But you could influence them in a really subtle way. There was a part of this conversation, the interview with Tom and Jim, that was really interesting, where Jim
That's what I was going to get to, but I'll let you carry on. I know what you're going to say.
Whether the phenomena was a kind of, it was just trying to impact us on a socio-cultural level. You know, he said, what's the point of a cattle mutilation? Well, we're sat here talking about it and talking about concepts that really stretch our understanding of the universe. And this kind of conversation is what advances us. And in your example, going back with an iPhone, you know, if you went back to Steve Jobs with an iPhone and you tried to explain it, he wouldn't have a goddamn clue how to make that thing. But you could say to him, every single person in the world has one of these. And he'd go, whoa, what? We can make computers for everyone? And then you kind of have the reason of being for Apple. And then their goal is to make computers for everyone, you know, not to make the iPhone, but to kind of proliferate that technology and impact our culture. So it's interesting, you know, you can kind of pull a broad stroke from the influence.
And that's I'm glad you said it. That's where I was going with that you couldn't explain it. You couldn't go back and tell them how to do it. You don't have the wherewithal and the know-how, but you know what it is and how to use it. And maybe some of the stuff we're getting, like Jim says, and you've heard this before in other interviews, is the fact that it's there to give us something to look at and talk about and start to work out, and maybe it advances our technology in some way, shape or form. If Roswell had been a crash that was deliberate, that we then used some of the technology to make the first computer chips. Do you know what? We never made anti-gravitational craft that could fly through the solar system, the universe, or different dimensions. Not at that point in time, maybe, but it did let us start to make or develop faster computers and a lot of technology that came after that. So maybe that's what they kind of got at in parts of the interview as well.
Yeah, they exemplified it at one point with talking about Project Galileo and saying that if Project Galileo gets one photograph, that is permission for every single scientist on this planet to turn their attention towards the subject. And we've seen over the past few years what can happen when scientists do that on a global scale. We went from no coronavirus vaccine to how many have we got now? And we're arguing over the different veracity. You know, it's a problem that we probably wouldn't have thought we would have. Like, we have so much advancement that we can't kind of pass it properly. And it would be wonderful to get to that point with this subject,
where they all get involved, and if people work together a little bit and pool the resources.
Climbing over each other to be involved in this, because this is huge. And that brings me to another thing that Tom was talking about, where someone said, what kept you up at night? What was it that you were told that kept you up at night? And he had this really great rant where he basically said, I'm not going to talk about that, and then spoke about it. And he said that it was kind of the realization. Well, he mentioned that there might be an influence to keep us suppressed in a weird way where they can take advantage, which I thought was interesting because it kind of plays into the war angle of the book series. Mm-hmm. But he said that once you kind of start to really internalize grok, the idea, that you start to look around you and not really trust your environment. And he said that his mum's, you know, full on Christian, goes to church every Sunday. And he said, but if his mum saw Jesus in her house with a crown of thorns floating towards her in the middle of the night, she would freak out. Like, it's a reality people aren't ready for. But it made me think of how religion, it kind of codifies ideas. You know, the Bible isn't necessarily exactly about the stories. They're about the lessons we take from the stories, right? And it kind of codifies these ideas. And we accept them safely in those forms. You know, like talking about the science of the Holy Trinity is crazy, but it seems like we're starting to get to a point where we can talk about the science of the body, spirit, and mind. And that's really interesting because, as Tom said, you know, that idea, that Holy Trinity kind of links all of the religions and all of the myths and things like that. So it's pointing that religion isn't really about the stories. It's about the physics it's hinting at.
Yeah, and I'm going to follow up on the religion point there. Just something that was just said before that. We don't even have to discuss it. I'm just going to throw this in there. Jim Semivan, once again, like Chris Mellon and other people have done, couldn't state more clearly, this is not Russia, this is not China, this is not the United States. It leaves nothing as the other option, and that nothing is non-human technology. He referred to it as, or non-human intelligence. It's clearly not human. he then paused and said, well, not human as we know it. But he'd done that thing that if you're an expert in body language, it was that he's correcting himself because there's something he knows or is aware of, because he does that thing where he looks at a certain way and goes, yeah, not as we know it, almost as if something inside's going, that's not quite right. It is kind of human.
It's a breadcrumb, right?
Yeah.
And that's the thing, like, the stuff that Tom in this interview kept saying, in my opinion, it's this. Like, Semivan's comments like this fit right in with what Tom was saying. And we've got to remember the statement right at the beginning that Tom hit the nail on the head, according to Semivan. So it's a bonanza of an interview, really.
Do you know what? I would like to go back and watch this interview again, but ask if Brian and Kurt could release the video of Tom talking, but I want to see Jim Semivan stream the whole time, because I want to see his reactions to what Tom's saying. And that's not something we got to see just with the way it's cut. And I would rather see how Jim's facials change with certain statements.
Yeah, I know what you mean. There was
just to see if there's any give or tell, or...
You know how, and on a similar line, how people are reacting. I thought Kurt had a great comment that I kind of really resonated with. He said, in Metal Gear Solid, when a guard was alerted, there would be like an exclamation mark over their head. And he said that this subject makes him constantly feel like that relates to it with a exclamation mark over his head. And I really identified with that.
Would that make like the Twitter trolls, the ones that are crawling about in cardboard boxes, hiding behind us all now and again, just knocking on walls, distracting us? That's what that is.
Playing up to the trickster element.
Yeah, and there's a little Metal Gear Solid reference for the folk on there. But listen, if Kurt Jaimungo can do it on a podcast with Jim Semivan and Tom DeLonge, then we can do it here.
It's the semiotics of our generation, right?
Absolutely. Now, listen, you mentioned religion before, and Tom talked about that, his mother's religious background and how devout Christian she is and everything like that. He also mentioned, I can't remember the follow-up or the context behind it, but it was in that same breath where he talks about ancient texts within that was it. So he was talking about the phenomenon didn't start in the 40s. It went back to long before that. He talked about petroglyphs. He talked about modern times, and he even talked about ancient texts in the Vatican vaults. That's a rabbit hole right there, and something that's the kind of stuff where I'm like, oh, it's a total sidebar, but it's a really good conversation to have. And I want to try and get someone on from that point of view that can talk about that whole idea of one of the things I was interested in years ago, folks. Okay, you know, one of those guilty pleasures that kind of gets you into the whole subject of like this, and like I love the idea of time travel and different ways to time travel, or even just different concepts. I like watching time travel movies to see how they do it. I'll watch even really bad time travel movies or YouTube clips just to see how the time travel works or how it looks. Okay,
have you? I've got to just ask here: have you seen Primer?
Yeah, the box.
Yeah. Cool. That's a good one for if anyone wants to see
and that's
probably
why
one
I
of the better
watched
ones, actually.
Yeah, quite low budget.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's why I watched that back in the day. And then you look at Tenet and the idea of the spinning, you know, it goes round and it takes 15 watches to understand it, if you're me. And I still don't totally do. But the idea, digressing, was that the Vatican has a time machine in its vault, which probably isn't true. However, the idea that they have a lot of stuff down there that pertains to this subject, for me, is fascinating. And it goes back to that whole point at the start of the interview, Dan, like you mentioned, where religion and science were once the same thing, and it's all physics, or what we call physics. And then you've got quantum physics and quantum mechanics and a whole load of other quantums that just start to potentially we would call magic, but it goes down a whole other realm of this is just how things work. It's not the paranormal, it's not supernatural, it's not quantum holographic theory. This is just how it works, but we still don't understand it, and it's got a load of different labels.
Yeah, absolutely. A load of different labels is the right term. You know, all the religions seem to have a connection to the heavens, which we think of as space and meteors and ET and all things like that. So we can interpret it in totally different ways. And at least the Bible is an assembled book from many, many, many different writings. Mm-hmm. So, if you want to talk about controlled narratives, there's one for you. You can explore the other books that aren't included, and it does make you wonder what else that's in the vault that they kind of don't show you. But it always brings me back to things like the Eleusinian mysteries, where basically the idea was that you would go to this place, Lucius, and you would take a psychedelic and be shown the truth of the universe, kind of thing. And they recently found out that actually the mysteries or the ceremony for the mysteries spill out of Lucius and was actually done around the world in basements and, kind of like what's going on now, where you've got a lot of centers around the world setting up to give people ayahuasca and give them mushrooms and, psilocybin just to influence them. And it kind of, researchers are finding that it gives people really interesting experiences that are hard to say aren't real. And that it kind of, I guess, almost refreshes a filter. There's a lot going on when they use it to treat PTSD and things like that. And it's kind of building towards what one of the researchers talks about as a trauma-free world, which is very interesting, because what would we do as a species if none of us had to deal with trauma?
Interesting. And if you want to dive in a little more about psychedelics and all that kind of stuff, DMT, mushrooms and other things, check out our interview with Dr. Andrew Gallimore that was a couple of weeks ago now, a few months ago, as you listen to this, but that was a really good one as well. Dan, I'm going to kick on, and this is one bit where I first went, TTSA had to pick between entertainment and science. They chose entertainment because of COVID, okay? This was in relation to why Lou and Chris Mellon left. I don't necessarily go with that as a legitimate explanation.
No, there was a little bit more in that Tom was saying that realistically they could never compete with people like Lockheed and Boeing and things like that, which, when they spoke about making the anti-gravity craft, all of us kind of went, wait a second, do you have that much money? So I understand that point, but, there's been some to and froing. But for me, at least the relationship is good. And it seems like the Beatles broke up and are having really great solo careers.
Yes, but when the Beatles broke up and went their different ways, some of them didn't stay together, which is what I don't understand. So why, if TTSA chose entertainment, like Tom said, is Jim Semivan still a part of the company? Because Jim Semivan is not an entertainer.
It's an interesting point, and I think it comes back to that kind of cultural influence. We've seen the impact stuff like the Marvel movies have had over the past few years. It's gone from something that was quite fun to things where we really heavily look to them for things like guidance over racial issues and female empowerment and things like that. They become vehicles to really influence the world. And I think if you can see the influence they have, you can kind of understand what Tom is trying to achieve by focusing on storytelling. He did say that he didn't want to, when he was having meetings in Hollywood, that he was always careful to say to people like, look, we don't need to embellish this. This is goddamn incredible anyway. We don't need to be overly dramatic.
Am I right? But he also said on the interview, it was just a throwaway line, that Hal, which would be Hal Puthoff, is also still involved with projects they have.
Yeah. Hal, I think it's the Scientific Advisory Board, but they're not really doing science, right?
But this is my point. Why come out and say we had to choose between entertainment and science? Have a serious guy like Jim Semivan sitting there, and then talk about a really well-known scientist like Hal Puthoff, and it doesn't work. It doesn't compute.
Like, I just reference the Marvel movies, and I know that Sean Carroll, proper legit scientist, physicist.
Did you put a pound coin in the jar?
I don't have any pound coins, but I will.
Oh, okay.
I will. And he was on set for Endgame, and he advised the science rules and the multiverse rules. So when people are watching the Marvel stuff now, they kind of almost have a crash course in quantum mechanics if they can kind of get their head around the multiverse with Loki and things like that. So if the science can be accurate, or as accurate as possible, that can be a whole other level of kind of authenticity to the storytelling. People love that about Christopher Nolan's films like Interstellar and stuff like that, because they use real concepts. The other thing I'd mention is that Tom did say that the materials project is still ongoing. So I wouldn't be surprised if Hal's being kind of retained for that reason.
Yeah, hopefully it gives me a little bit of hope for TTSA that it's still something that's worth keeping an eye on. I'm interested in the movies the movie that's going to come out, Monsters in California, is due out in a couple of months, I believe.
Yeah, that's
hopefully,
right.
or they're finishing filming at least. It's post-production just now. Is that right?
The
from what I've seen?
soundtracking.
Okay,
Probably soundtracking pickups and effects.
Yeah, so that'll be an interesting watch, and hopefully I think Hal Putov and Jim Semivan provide some semblance of credibility to any scientific effort that's ongoing, and seeing them on board is good. And it is nice to hear that they still have that relationship with like Luella Zondo, Chris Mellon. It wasn't a awkward breakup or end of the marriage or anything like that. So that was kind of good to hear. Moving on from that, Jim Semivan was asked kind of outright about do they have any alien bodies? Do any governments worldwide have alien bodies? Jim Semivan could have said no, he could have poo-pooed it. He just went straight in with I'm not going to comment on that. Which, that isn't him saying, yes, they do, or I know where they are. But that, for me, is a lead to, there's stuff I could talk about, but I can't and won't, which is interesting for me still.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we know that Semivan knows things that he can't talk about, and he does allude to, when he talks about the UAP report, the preliminary one, he does allude to the fact that he liked that there were potshots at the Air Force in there because he knew why the Air Force wasn't collaborating, but he didn't want to elaborate on it. So there's definitely, it's kind of one of those things though that it's almost like a choose your own adventure thing, right? They're the frustrating comments, because to us that could mean something totally different to what Mick West reads into it, right?
Yep. Dan, page 12 of Choose Your Own Adventure. Dan, do any governments worldwide have an alien body?
No comment.
Okay. Is that a yes?
No comment? I'd be rubbish under an NDA.
Yeah,
you'd terrible poker face.
You would break so easily, wouldn't you? You could never do that kind of job.
I'm just excited for everyone to know about the subject, so I just tell them gleefully.
Yeah. Winking as you say no. So yeah. Tom DeLonge goes on to talk about metamaterials a little bit that we've touched on. There is a comment made about these beings have been around for so long, they wouldn't be interested in our DNA, or Tom uses the example of what our spleen does, for example, so why are they mutilating cows? Because that cattle mutilations is brought up a few times in this. So for me, if it makes no sense that, they know us, they know our, like, literally they know us inside and out, literally and figuratively, then why are they taking apart cows?
It's a very good question. Tom mentioned something I've not heard mentioned before at this point, where he speaks about whether they were looking at the food chain for some reason. He doesn't really elaborate on it, but I thought it was an interesting comment.
I mean, I get it's a way of studying humanity. They eat a lot of meat and beef, and okay, so we're going to do this. There's a whole other conversation. You get the missing 4. What's the number for? Missing 411? Is that it?
Oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Like, I mean, it's a whole other conversation. It's a horrible topic to bring up, people going missing and never having closure of a family member, friend, or relative, or whatever it may be, who does go missing and is never found. But is there a potential there that some of these are abductions where people are not returned for whatever reason? It would be horrible to think of, but if they're mutilating cows, then maybe that's just because they're having a look at the whole ecosystem, and that's how it works. So that's an interesting notion potentially, but it just doesn't make sense to me that they know us so well, but they will still pick a cow up and remove its heart without any incisions, and they'll cut along a cell with surgical, what better than surgical precision, and all that kind of stuff as well. So that was an interesting one for me. But cattle mutilations definitely seem from anyone who comes out as an expert, not people who are necessarily experts or have books to do with cattle mutilations, but when you hear government insiders or people like Tom DeLonge who are sort of in the know to an extent, they never seem to really give a good reason or seem to admit why cattle mutilations happen. It seems one of those genuine mysteries.
Around this point, I got the impression, because Tom spoke about human history and how if you look at our developments, it's kind of us digging through layers. We had the surface world, then we started looking at bacteria, and then we went smaller to atoms, and now it's a quantum, and it's kind of us coming down and down and down. And he says that next is consciousness. And I kind of took that as him suggesting that there would be reasons for them taking the cows that we just can't understand from our point of view.
It's a funny one, and do you know what? It's given how long the podcast's been going now, I probably do need to have that kind of deep dive into the conversation. But that's something we'll have a little dig into, because Dan and I are at some point in the next few days going to be having a chat around future guests and stuff. So more and more of you, when we give shout outs for suggestions, are getting in touch, which is great for this kind of stuff. So if there are anyone from a guest point of view you want to hear from, I mean, you can tell me Tom DeLonge and Chris Mellon and Bob Lazar all you like. Don't think that I'm not trying to arrange those. That is absolutely it. But if there's someone that you think doesn't get a lot of attention or as much attention as they should, then please give us a shout. We're more than happy to talk to people that aren't necessarily big names. That's not why we're in this. We just want to hear some interesting points of view and conversations. So please kind of drop us a message in any of the usual channels.
Especially if anyone's listening and did any work on the hairstyle and lights, we'd like to talk to you.
Oh, Dan would. Yeah, no, I'd like that as well, yeah. Interesting comment was made about stuff being picked up by satellite. Again, this is something where we've touched on before.
Can we just go back just a little bit? Because there was another comment that...
no, we have to keep moving. Time only moves in one direction.
It was the bodies question.
Go on.
And Tom basically kind of... He didn't say, yes, we have bodies. He said that the steps that he's seeing happening now are the logical steps that might one day lead to, hey, we collected some stuff. Look at this.
Yeah.
Which I thought, again, really, really interesting, because he could have said no, but instead he kind of said, well, if they did, this is kind of how the process would look.
Because he kind of got at the point of, and when he says stuff, what he means is potentially some crashed material, potentially an intact craft,
and
potentially
the question
a body.
Was literally about bodies, so stuff I would take, definitely in that context.
Absolutely, and the idea being that he mentioned the context behind that were, several steps behind that sort of announcement or unveiling or disclosure with a capital D is because they might not understand what it is. And it's not a case of they wouldn't want to wheel out, here is an, in quotes, alien body, because the questions would be, where's it from? Why are they here? Where are they? Where are they now? Is there more of them? Are they dangerous? Is it potentially, contaminated? And they potentially couldn't answer any of those questions. And what would the point be?
Can you remember us talking about The End of Contact, the book?
Yes.
Where I was saying the ending was interesting because essentially what they said to the people who'd gone to this other dimension or to another place in space, they said, look, we don't have any evidence for what you experienced, but we believe that you experienced it. Don't go do a press conference now because we can't answer anything and we can't prove it. But if you will quietly fund your research, and then when you're ready to unveil, we will stand by you. And that's it's about the most wholesome place a conspiracy could start. It might have transformed over the years as it kind of got passed along, and people didn't really appreciate that beginning point was always to say, look, let's just take our time and we'll be clear when we can be clear. But now, the military industrial complex comes in and complicates that in a very big way.
Yeah. I like Jim Semivan being really honest, and I know some people definitely won't like this. I don't necessarily totally subscribe to it, but I get the feeling, I lean more towards what Jim was saying than not, that the government isn't all powerful or as secretive as some would make out from a totally far extreme conspiracy point of view. When the PSYOP stuff was mentioned, I won't go into detail on that. We talked about that beforehand, Dan, for reasons. Like, it's illegal, and there are still elements of things that the government, especially now, don't get involved in. And he was quite offended almost at the idea of all of these different psyops, and his thing was, no, we couldn't do that. The governments don't do that. There are still some good people in the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, the DOD, and we're just talking American here, but even make that British, Italian, Russian, French, Chinese, whatever, there are still people doing jobs just at different levels. I don't doubt there's levels of politics and levels of secrecy and at times potentially some underhanded tactics. But again, it's the idea of that compartmentalization as well, that the government, what is the government? It's the government is not just a couple of people in a shadowy room. And I think that's what people tend to mean when they say the government, isn't it? It's not the president and those beneath him. It's, the secret cabal that meet up with a kind of top-ranking general and the guy who's got the cabinet behind him with all the real UFO files, and the kind of small group with the shadowy figure with the smoking man in the corner. And maybe that happens, maybe it doesn't. And you could kind of see him like that there are still people in his organizations that do a lot of good work as well. Tom DeLonge mentioned he doesn't think it's stuff coming from deep space. He mentions oceans, mentions areas around the planet that should be looked at and studied, maybe not necessarily so far in outer space. And again, we mentioned this earlier, just bringing it back to when it was towards the end of the interview, that potentially these objects materialize around the planet. And we did touch on that already. Anything you want to add to that, Dan?
Only, I guess, as a Tom fan, it just maybe snort a little bit when he said, no, it's in Utah, it's just the future. Like, I know it's a joke, but it's such we're linked, man. We're like mind melding. We've been doing this a long time.
Can you think of what one word I put as my note for that?
Go on.
Well, I'll ask you to guess, because I've got Tom DeLonge, brackets, it's in Utah, just in the future, and then I've made one word of a note and a question mark.
Mankind's.
Boom. Look at that. Yeah. So, yes, I've just put mankind's. And is that the reference to, because we submitted some questions for this and they didn't read out many, if any. And that's what I wanted to know straight off the bat is, what's Tom's idea of what Lou said about mankind's? Tom's a lot more loose-lipped than others. So,
well, the great thing is that, and I'm kind of pulling the end of the interview just forward a little bit, just so people don't lose hope, that someone suggested doing a part 2, and Tom basically said, if we do a part 2, I suggest that we dig into something more about what the phenomena is about and what it's actually doing. And they all completely agreed to do that, which I'm really excited for. It's almost like, let's just speculate amongst, a scientist, someone that's been talking to government officials, it's going to be really, really, maybe fun is the wrong word because this is very serious subject, but it's something that I'm very excited about.
Yeah, and that was pretty much nearing the end of the interview. The last kind of parts where Jim Semivan spoke to scientists, and we've touched on this a little bit, who said the phenomenon answer or mystery lay between consciousness and quantum mechanics, and somewhere in that space is kind of what's going on. But it's stuff that we've probably only touched on as a civilization and our best minds and brains and thinkers. Do you know what? Our best minds and brains probably aren't even on this yet, which is part of the problem.
Yeah.
Which is why we're kind of so far behind it. And it's great the people who are, like Jacques Vallée and Hal Puthoff and Eric Davis and those kind of guys, that if Bob Lazar worked on it, great. Thanks, Bob Lazar, for your efforts and whatnot. But our very best minds probably still aren't on this, and that's who we need to get involved to kind of work it out. And speaking of the very best minds, one of the last names that was brought up was Dr. Stephen Greer, because the final question asked was about CE5 by Kurt, and Jim Semivan, I thought, gave an interesting answer where he credited Stephen Greer's early work, and he made a point of saying that, I appreciate the work he done early on, and I think that says it all about where things went. Tom's answer was, again, it was typically Tom DeLonge, where he just said that it's something that needs to be studied scientifically, as in we don't fully understand it yet, and maybe it's a product that, obviously we know it as a product that Stephen Greer's released, and, human-initiated contact, well, as James Iandoli would potentially refer to it as, if not CE5, is something that is maybe not necessarily totally understood yet. Well, of course it's not. I mean, just think about what we're talking about. But it's been packaged and put out there as, you can pay this to learn how to do this. And like Tom's kind of mentioned there, maybe there's something in it, but we really need to be studying it scientifically. And the people who would want to do that, again, those best minds, we're not yet there yet in that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. His answer was great, though, where he talked about, he mentioned something about the progression of humanity and how we won't be happy forever with just looking at radio waves. It's going to extend beyond that. We'll be looking at consciousness. And he said, when you start thinking about things like that, what would be louder than a group of people intensely focusing or thinking? If you could pick up people focusing or thinking, they would be the brighter sparks in a dark place, you know? Yeah. So it makes sense. You can follow a kind of logic to it.
Absolutely. So do you know what? Really good interview. I enjoyed it. Yeah. It's worth the hour and 24 minutes of your time.
It's really the one everyone's been waiting for from Tom, I think. And I'm looking forward to part 2.
Yeah, it left me definitely wanting more. But and I've not seen too many people say this, but I've seen a few people say they were disappointed or it never gave us any new information, and that's not correct if you've watched it in that sense. So hopefully you've listened to this. Go and watch it. I've retweeted the link several times and all sorts. It's available on, let me just get the name of it completely correct, Into the Impossible with Brian Keating. It's available on YouTube. Go and check it out. It's worth your 84 minutes. So yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed this breakdown as well. Moving on, Bob Fish is a name that was brought up by Ross Coulthart in several of his interviews, and he was someone who was involved in the John Podesta WikiLeaks, it was WikiLeaks, yeah.
Yeah, WikiLeaks.
Some of the emails that came out as a name who was going back and forward with, the Clintons and Tom DeLonge back in the day was involved in all that as well, as to discussing the UFO issue. And basically, Ross Coulthart has said he is a name that is not out there enough that people are trying to contact. I was saving this for when I spoke to Ross, but that's now been moved back to September. I did reach out to Bob Fish straight away as soon as I heard Ross mention this in one of his interviews, and Bob was very gracious to respond to me with quite a comprehensive, a couple of emails actually, and I asked him if I could use what he said as a quote. So it's going to take a minute or so, but I'm going to read out everything that he said to me because there's some really interesting stuff in there as well. And I did ask Dan this beforehand if I thought I should read it out or just read bits of it. And Dan definitely said, yeah, go for it.
Whole thing. I knew this was coming, so I was sure to mention the radio waves thing. And I just kind of mentioned to people to keep an ear out for lines about the spectrum.
Yeah, so given what we've just heard in the interview last night, and we've heard in other interviews past and previous, here was Bob Fish's thoughts that he emailed me over a couple of weeks ago. And again, I'll dig into this with Ross Coulthart. I'm not very interested in expanding my footprint in the UFO community. UFOs are an intellectually interesting phenomenon to me, but not one I want to dive deeply into because of some flaky history in the past, probably due to US government and maybe religious interventions. The thing I was trying to do had to do with John Podesta possibly opening up the UFO files if he was White House Chief of Staff. I was simply responding to that initiative, telling him where to look for the empirical stuff, since everyone has seen the blurry shots of some bright object in the sky or heard about the silent triangle of lights zooming in the night sky, etc. This is like doing an audiobook, you know that? He never said that, I'm just adding that bit in. One would have to be really clueless to not think our military and intelligence agencies have been collecting information since at least 1947, and I'd argue the Foo Fighters of World War II even pushed that back a bit. Quick shout out to Graham Rendell and his upcoming book on just that subject. It seems that now some portions of the US government are willing to drag out their radar intercept tapes and UAP incident communications. Perhaps others will soon put forth additional empirical information about tracking or monitoring even interfering with strange flying phenomena. So I'm willing to wait and see on this. Someday soon, we should be able to cross-reference information from a human sighting with an airspace radar scan or sea space acoustic scan and a high-resolution image, whether visual or multispectral. More importantly are the concepts that Dr. Edgar Mitchell came out with. We keep talking about aliens, in inverted commas, as being from another planet or galaxy, like they live far, far away. Well, maybe they are simply from a different universe that also utilises Earth as a home. If so, maybe they are more like ancestors whose culture has evolved beyond ours at this time. Or maybe a combo of faraway visitors with nearby non-human Earthlings. I mean, does anyone really think these little 30-feet saucers flew 450 light years to get here? If so, then I guess the Earth is flat too, eh? As we move forward with string theory, DNA analysis, gene splicing, and artificial intelligence, we may make some interesting discoveries about the life that inhabits the Earth. Hopefully, MUFON or somebody will get their act together and start working on this from a critical thinking perspective and large data fusion project. But that is another story. Thanks, Edgar. I'll take a pause for breath there because that was the first email, and I've got a second interesting follow-up as well. Dan, initial thoughts on that response?
It's a huge response considering that he doesn't want a bigger footprint. A lot of it vibes with what was said in the interview with Tom and Jim, which is what I found most startling. There are all these little synchronicities there. And yeah, it's just a very startling email. A lot of it's very matter of fact. When I just didn't expect that from Bob.
Yeah, like I say, I did ask him when he set that massive response. I didn't ask for that, and he gave that willingly, which was great. And I said if he ever changed his mind, I would love to host him on the podcast, and I'd love to hear him on any podcast. Yeah, I'm not, professionally jealous that if he chose to go on some other, bigger platform, that would be great. But I would love to speak to him, just given the breadth of the answer. He then followed up, again, I didn't ask for this, he gave me some more information. I did mention to others about when we cross-connected Edgar Mitchell with the IRVA, which is the International Remote Viewers Association, in 2001 at their annual conference. This is the remote viewers organisation that grew out of Project Stargate. My first meeting with Edgar was literally in an isolation chamber, aka the Apollo 14 mobile quarantine facility in March 2001. It was a pretty amazing conversation. I don't know if you've had any contact with the IRVA, but they have had a few very interesting contact cases that helped Edgar have a better grasp on the brackets alien thing. The second generation remote viewers after Pat Price, Ingo Swann, Russell Targ, etc., who paved the way, still get together once a year. The hardest part of going down the quantum hologram path, interesting use of words there.
Yeah,
Dan,
double underline that.
Yep. The hardest part of going down the quantum hologram path is understanding there is no such thing as time, and it helps to understand there is a much broader electromagnetic spectrum than what we humans can measure and monitor. Once someone groks that, the universe opens up quite a bit. There is much that our eyes can't see and ears can't hear, but our mind can view, if not interact with. I found that really interesting. For reference, for Christians, it's like saying that the true question to ask for becoming nearer to God is not, where can he be found? That's already been answered, everywhere. Which is to say for oneself, here. The real question to ask is, when is God? And the answer eventually becomes obvious, now. There is a vast living universe, or set of universes swirling all around us, but we humans tend to narrowly focus our mind on rushing to our next meeting in 10 minutes, hoping we get a few likes on our next social media post, pondering the calorie intake of the food we're eating, or worrying about the pandemic. It's like we're trying to make digital copies of ourselves, avatars, rather than expand our consciousness to a higher capability. And yes, this absolutely has a lot to do with UFOs and aliens. So again,
So
like Dan
intriguing.
says, yeah, for a guy who isn't up for getting involved or dipping his toe back into the UFO community, I would ask him again to please put yourself out there on someone's show or podcast or give someone some of your time, because that's a fascinating response to a question I didn't even begin to ask.
Absolutely. For someone to say, essentially stop building tools and start shoving ayahuasca into your face, that's I'd love to talk to him.
Dan, it's one of my favourite interviews that never even happened. So thanks to Bob. I'm not egomaniacal enough to think he's listening to this, but public thank you for giving that information. And again, he gave permission to share that as well. And hopefully in the future we can get to speak to Bob, as much of what he shared there from a really interesting place is what was in that interview last night. And Ross Coulthart is someone who many people are putting a lot of eggs in his basket at the moment. And we will be speaking to him in around 3 or 4 weeks. He vouches for Bob Fish in a huge way as well. So
he does, and I'd really, really recommend people read Ross's book. I think I've got about a half hour left of the audiobook, but it's really fantastic. He's been very thorough. He hasn't just taken people's words for things. He's gone over and above where he needs to produce a book like he's done. So it's something that I feel people should invest time into reading.
Absolutely. So some really interesting stuff. I did put out onto Twitter to ask people's thoughts on the interview from last night. And I'll share some of those with you now. Craig, who's he was actually the original Patreon of the show. So thanks to Craig, who's stuck around all this time. They needed to do this interview a year ago. Tom is learning from Jim how to sell this better, but is it too late? I guess we find out with the September SEC report. What do you think, Dan?
Really interesting. Every year, whenever those SEC reports are filed, it tends to bring slight little revelations in kind of what their plans are. So I'm always eager to see those. I think it'll clear up a lot of what people are asking about the future of TTSA.
Yeah, Joe commented that the interview felt a little light on details. It was fairly introductory for an audience new to ufology. The questions could have been more probing with better informed hosts, but at least TTSA is getting a broader and more scientific audience. Do you know what? I get that. But again, it's not a UFO podcast. There's stuff in there that I wouldn't have asked, rightly or wrongly, because I come from a bias of not everyone knows everything, and this is something I think I had to learn as an interviewer early on, where some of the feedback was I would have liked the more basic questions to kick off with, and I know there's people listening to this that have an incredible knowledge, far better than my own, and I'm lucky to speak to the guests, and for a time I was just asking questions for that audience, but then you realise there are a whole host of people new to the subject or not familiar with a certain guest, and you have to cater to everyone. So I thought they'd done quite a good job of what they asked, and maybe for me what lacked, but we might get in further follow-ups, is a little bit more probing into some of the answers that were given.
Yeah, and it's a good point you make, actually, that audience isn't necessarily us. It's not the UFO community. As much as we were there and we were excited, we were all screaming McCaslin in the chat, and that question never came, because it's a fairly, you need to be fairly dug into the subject to understand the whole WikiLeaks thing and the General McCaslin connection. But when you look at that video as an introduction video for people, there are some concepts in there that I didn't come across for years and years and years into researching the phenomena. So it's one of those little breadcrumbs that is going to cause so many people to go off on their own paths and start looking at these ideas. And it's a science channel, so as Avi said, they are the scientists. This is who we want getting these ideas.
And you know what? If you get a chance to watch this, and please do go and watch that interview back on YouTube, you can see the chat at the side at the same time, and there's loads of the usual names and faces, or not faces because it's a chat, it's text, but you'll see the avatars in there and the comments, and there's lots of people with an interest in the subject who are involved. Dan was in there, and Gaucho and all those guys as well. But there are other people who obviously aren't interested in the UFO subject, and you do get the comments of, it must be a slow news week having these guys on, because they don't know who they are necessarily, or they don't care, and they see UFO chat as being beneath them. So fair play and kudos to them having that conversation, that sometimes they have introduced guests to a new audience that's not just for UFOs, and people can forget that sometimes, that it's not just for you. I think it's a very intimate medium. Podcasting in an audio form for me is the purest, because you're literally talking to that person. Like right now, I am the voice inside your head. Sorry to freak you out, okay? And Dan is there as well.
Time traveling through space and being in people's heads.
All of that stuff. You could be listening to this in 1,000 years' time. Say hi to the aliens for me, right?
That's weird to think about.
It really is. But we're talking to you, and this is for you. You're not watching it as part of a crowd. YouTube, you have the chat function, but again, it's generally just you sitting watching it. So if you're watching Tom and Jim Semivan from a place of knowing who they are and their background and context, you're watching the same interview as someone brand new to this subject who has no idea who they are, but you're absorbing the content in two very different ways. So that's for me what's got to be considered as well. And it's the same, like I say, with an audio format where you're ingesting what from the interviews, what you want. So fair play again to Kurt for being a part of that, and also Brian for hosting that. Tom, not Tom DeLonge, but Tom Mosher, he thought thoughts on how dismissive they were of the concept of reaching out or CE5. I know their feelings seemed influenced by their opinion of Greer, but they also made it seem like this was a bridge too far. I think, I suppose from their point of view, they're trying to have Tom talked about the steps that we need to take to get to where we want, and it's a big jump to go, are they from here? Are they from elsewhere? Do we have bodies? What's the science or physics involved to, you can contact them if you just do some meditating and reach out and have this really incredible experience.
Quite frankly, it sounds batshit to someone who isn't versed in the subject. That's all it sounds. You just look crazy. And it's a really good example of how you can try and have a conversation with the best intentions and the best knowledge base, but you just get dismissed. We need data. That's how we go, oh, CE5 works. Or, it'll be a different term when we eventually get to that point. But we just need data.
Dan, in the same way that 40 years ago, the iPhone would have sounded crazy to Steve Jobs, but he needed data. And it spawned the eventual iPhone, but it's what are the products or the concepts or ideas that need to be understood before we get to that point.
Well, you can go back on, you can go on YouTube and look at, the carousel of the future in Disney and the World's Fairs and see what they were doing and what they thought the future would look like. And it's always really interesting to go look at those things, because some things they get so wrong, but some things they were, so prescient on. And if it wasn't for those people dreaming up these concepts, no one would have ever tried to tackle them. It needs to be an idea before it becomes a reality.
Yeah. Carl, I get you can't say Carl in a Scottish accent. That's Carl. It just sounds exactly the same as Carol and Carl. Carl thought the biggest takeaway was Tom's suggestion that the others are creating time displacement bubbles. Tom's suggestion was that the others experience time differently and access our reality through it. The others aren't coming from outer space. While there could be aliens here, what TTSA seems to know about is localized to Earth, but not necessarily the same dimension as ours. I think we covered that pretty well, and Carl's kind of took from it what we did in that respect.
Yeah, for sure. And I'll just throw in my cat point theory again here. That the cat point is never broadcast from the Nimitz. It's a pre-agreed upon point, and then over the radio they just say, go to your cat point. And as we all know, the Tic Tac went to the cat point before and they went there, and it shouldn't have known. But to me, there's an interesting kind of idea that if they kind of see time as a smudge and, it's like a long exposure, that they would have seen that line extending from Fraser's Plain all the way to the cat point and could have just followed it and said, hey, look, this is what we're doing. And it could have just been a demonstration of how they see the universe. Same as stopping nuclear missiles at 1 second. It's never dangerous to them. It's just how they see the universe, and they're trying to demonstrate it, and we keep thinking about weapons.
But was the idea, again, because I know some people may be listening to this going, no, Dan, that's wrong.
It's an idea, yes.
Yeah,
they can change.
To do with the cap point, it was used already during that exercise before they had the Tic Tac encounter. So it could have been an observation rather than something that they knew or picked up or seen broadcast. They literally could have seen that was an area being used. So just for those who might be shouting at Dan.
And you make a good point, actually, because even though we speculate, it's me speculating. It really is an idea. This isn't like, Tom, I haven't been in a room with all of these officials that have all this secret information. I'm just trying to put two and two together and come up with ideas like the rest of you guys, and they could be wrong, and it's okay to be wrong, because sometimes we just don't know.
And if Dan's wrong anymore, he'll be getting replaced. So Nick, he said it was equally interesting and frustrating. I appreciate the update on the reasons for Chris and Lou parting with TTSA, but because Tom's been read into top secret, he can't really discuss much either, but he did a good job hinting at things and talking around the specifics. You just wonder if most of the important information will always remain classified. But I thought the whole idea is Tom's not been read into top secret and that he's just being around people who have. I mean, I don't doubt there's stuff he knows, but it seems to me very much like he's probably been talked to in analogies and bits and pieces that he's had to put together himself. Maybe he does know a couple of bits and pieces he technically shouldn't. That would be down to the individuals who discuss with them what they have. But yeah, good shout. Gerald, he said he hadn't watched it and doesn't have to, because we are going to break it down and look forward to our thoughts. So I hope he's enjoyed that.
Yeah,
and Todd had asked yeah, Todd had asked where he can find the interview, and I've also retweeted that as well. So thanks. Just to finish up, folks, on this one, I hope you've enjoyed us breaking this down. On the Discord chat that you get access to as being part of Patreon, or if you're on the Apple Podcast premium subscription, give me a shout and we can share the link with you. There was a question being asked on the chat that had a lot of discussion, and I'm going to ask it to Dan. Dan, on a scale of 1 to 10, with no comment being not being an option, how much does Lou Elizondo know about the phenomenon that he hasn't already discussed due to NDAs, etc.? I will say that in the chat, the average number seemed to be about a 7, that most people were quite confident there's quite a lot he hasn't discussed due to NDAs.
This is hard to answer.
It's not. It's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10. I mean, it's
only because there are people we speak to that, you know, I pick up impressions from people, probably in the same way that Tom does, just being around people and hearing the conversations. So it's hard to answer, but I would put it on the upper end of the scale. So
Dan, remember,
7, 8, 9, around there.
We are not that podcast that quotes anonymous sources or does the whole, you know, we talk to some really high level.
Well, it's not anonymous. That's not me. Sean's a good friend to me, and, you know, Sean's almost, you know, a brother to Luis Elizondo, and I'd never betray that trust. But I would just say the upper end of that.
Yeah,
scale.
Dan's flashing 10 fingers at the screen now. No, he's not. But yeah, no, I appreciate that. And to be fair, I don't think it's unfair that most people would go with that anyway.
Yeah.
And do you know what? If nothing else, more in hope, because it would actually be a little bit of a letdown and deflating if, imagine Lou did come out one day and go, actually, everything I've kind of said is pretty much what I know. You would go, oh, is that it? As amazing as it's been, you'd be like, kind of hope there would be like a little bit more in there. I imagine there is, and Lou's kind of hinted as much, hasn't he?
Yeah.
If you're going to sit on Fox News and when Tucker Carlson asks you about crash materials and crashed craft being retrieved, and he says, you know, yes, then come on, that's not a guess. That's from a place of knowledge that he couldn't follow up. So
it's another good example of all of these guys will say, in my opinion, and then drop a bombshell. But they will never say the government kind of said this, and they're trying to kind of ease the government over into talking about the subject, which is, you know, we were getting to. Jim Semivan said in the interview that one of the most amazing things that he's heard in the past, you know, year or so, is that when he spoke to, Tom said that when he spoke to the former member of the UAPTF, the guy who got replaced, you know, in the last year, that he said the most amazing thing was that they don't have to be in a skiff to talk about this anymore. They can actually just have the conversation openly around the coffee table in the Pentagon and in the corridors, you know? And if you were a secret keeper, that would be terrifying, because there's no getting it back in your office once that starts happening.
Do you know what we need to find is the person, whether it's Lou Elizondo or otherwise, who, you know, they all seem to have these little bits of information that all, and Tom, this was actually one of my notes from earlier, and I left it out just because doing some live editing while we had the conversation to move things on, I went past it, but all these different generals and high-ranking people and scientists and physicists tell Tom bits and pieces, okay, and he pieces it all together. But it's clearly all stuff they're pretty much okay to say in some way, shape or form. There must be one person who could just say all this at the same time, and that would be really useful.
Cough,
as opposed
Eric Davis, cough.
Well, yeah, and maybe that's why Eric Davis tries to limit his interviews, because he doesn't seem to like keeping it all in, does he?
No, but we should remember that all of his comments have not gotten him into trouble. Yeah. And if, you know,
as far as we know, we don't know what goes on in the background. Sure. Yeah, sure. You don't know that, and this is, I suppose, the kind of darker side to it. But you don't know that Lou and Chris and Eric Davis are anyone really, really involved. And do you know what? Let's put people like John Greenwald potentially in that as well. Don't get text messages or, you know, threatening emails and stuff because of what they're talking about or what they say. What do you think, Dan?
Yeah, there's certainly an undercurrent of, I guess it brings us back to things like disinformation campaigns and Richard Doty and things like that, kind of diluting and muddying the waters that we're trying to swim in, and it just makes it harder.
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, I hope people have enjoyed the catch up, and it was a good interview. It's been nice to kind of talk through it and pick apart some of those ideas. And do you know what's reassuring for me is when you hear these interviews and it's like stuff we have discussed in the past on the podcast. And
Yeah.
it makes me think that we're along the right lines, and some of these ideas have been discussed at high levels, and there's a chance that maybe some of the things we think are correct, which is comforting in a way. So
Yeah,
yeah,
certainly.
all good.
Am I okay just to read out something that Jim Semivan said? I think it's a permanent thing to kind of close out with.
Please, yeah.
So at the end of the interview, they were asked how do people get involved, and Semivan had a kind of little bit of a rant that I wrote down because I thought it was just great. He said, "Don't let the government sit quietly. There are human beings that work there, and they get distracted. There's not much win in it for people to start talking about this subject when it means they can't get their job done. Don't let them live this down. Bring this up in a debate, in the press, to the president, to the PR. We're quiet and complacent after getting a report that says it's real, and it blows my mind. In my opinion, they know a hell of a lot more than we know. Black programs don't tend to have a mechanism for public releases, so we need to apply pressure, and finally they will act on the will of the people. The government doesn't own this data. It doesn't own the subject. It's appearing to everyone, everywhere. And we won't discuss classified info, but the public has to know that the consensus reality we all agree on isn't right."
Nice way to round out. Just a very quick update, as Joe Murgia has messaged me as we are finishing up. He's not going to tweet the stuff because it's quite a comprehensive email that I read out before from Bob Fish. He is going to put it on his next blog.
Cool.
And he will kind of share his thoughts on there too. So he's very much appreciated. Yeah, it's some good. So again, he will have that on there if you want to read it in text form as well, folks. Dan and I will be recording some more shows coming up. You've got the listener call-in part 2 due out in a couple of days' time. We're going to do that long-awaited What If Day After Disclosure pod as well. And the Futurama one is still happening. People are asking about it, but we are going to do it. It's just getting to it, but we are going to set aside time for it in the next few days as well. So lots to still come this month, and hopefully I can announce who's doing that special listener Q&A soon with us as well. Or maybe more than one person. I don't know yet. We'll see. But anyway, cheers, Dan. Thank you.
Thank you.
Speak to you soon, folks. That is all for this week's show. Thank you very much for listening. Please remember to leave the podcast a review on your chosen platform. You can like, retweet and subscribe. That would all be very much appreciated. The shows are being uploaded onto YouTube as we speak more and more. You can sign up at patreon.com/thatUFO podcast to access the shows ad-free as well. Please get in touch on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, That UFO Podcast. Of course, on Twitter, it's at UFO UAPAM. And again, folks, as always, keep looking up. You never know what you might see.
It wasn't a Tic Tac and not quite a saucer, more like a hubcap designed by Chaucer, a little Baroque and quite steampunk, like Alice was playing bass for the Parliament of Folk. The little fucker hovered right outside of my window, and when I shoved out the screen, he made it an issue. I don't think he expected me to see his ass, but I'd had some champagne and smoked a little ass. Meditative gamma state full on meta. You can't imagine how it could have been any better. I got to the top of the stairs and there he was. Like, you awake? I was about to abduct you, cuz. I jumped back and nearly kissed myself, and I climbed out the window after the elf, and I woke up in my bed and there was something on my head and everything was weird and everything was red. And I called out to my boys. They thought this was noise. They thought it was a dream. They thought it was my toys. They thought it was my problems, and they think I should seek therapy, and I don't know what it is because it doesn't really scare me. If you really want to know who I think they be, I think it's you and me and us and we and him and her and that and she and that thing over there and what's that, Jake? But if we're being serious, open your mind, consider your heart, consider time, consider your space, consider your lies, consider your life, consider your eyes.